Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, CASA of Maryland on the hot seat after it expresses solidarity with the Palestinian statement from the river to the sea. And Tilden Middle School teacher suspended for pro-Hamas social media posts. Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by former county council member and CEO of SkillSmart, Mike Knapp, and Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. The attack by the terrorist organization Hamas on communities in Israel, resulting in the death of approximately 1,200 Israeli citizens and 31 Americans, has caused a political upheaval unrivaled in America. The generally unified left of center advocacy groups have been bitterly divided over whether to support or condemn Israel's right to self-defense or justify the Hamas attack as a response to Israeli apartheid and occupation of Gaza. These divisions are not limited to protests on college campuses or marches and demonstrations in the nation's capital. These divisions are playing out in our communities. Locally, as CASA de Maryland, the influential Latino immigration advocacy organization, has come under extreme criticism after the group's president, Gustavo Torres, released statements and media posts expressing solidarity with the Palestinian slogan, "From the river to the sea," as war rages in Gaza. Mike, CASA has grown since its founding in 1985 into a political powerhouse, not just locally, but nationally as well. Last month, CASA was credited for helping Democrats in Virginia with holding on to the state Senate and retaking the lower chamber. Supporters like the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation have been a longtime supporter of the organization, their largest financial backer, and they announced this week that they are no longer financially supporting CASA. In addition, all 9 Montgomery County state senators have openly criticized CASA over their actions. How did this happen? And more importantly, why did this happen?
Well, I think one of the challenges is, and we see this a lot, and oftentimes it doesn't kind of manifest itself in something as visible as this, is a lot of our organizations have their advocacy arm and have their outreach and their community service and engagement where they're actually providing services. And oftentimes the lines between those two pieces get blurred, and the tax status and the types of organizations and what's being funded. And I think that's part of it. Part of what's at issue here is CASA does some great work in supporting the community. And CASA is also a political organization, and there have to be some lines drawn there. And I think part of the challenge that you've seen here is that blurring and people being on kind of both sides of that line. And I think that makes it really challenging. That do they have the right to make certain political statements? They most definitely do if they're structured the right way. But if you're doing that, that falls into this compartment. If you're trying to get money from state, local, county government to be able to provide services to the residents of our community, that's a different bucket of activity. And you've got to be really clear where those resources are going and where those resources are being allocated and what you're saying as a result of that. And I think that that's where this problem presented itself, because I don't think they paid attention to that. I don't think those lines were drawn in the right way.
Well, I want to follow up, and because I mean, one would think that CASA's main goal was advocacy on behalf of Latinos. Mm-hmm. And this strain into other areas, is that, beyond their main mission, is that a general phenomena? I mean, where a general progression, or is that something that's just carried away in the heat of the moment?
When we say straying into other areas, I think, politically, if they're providing advocacy for the Latino population, I think what you say at the beginning, focusing on elections in Virginia, focusing on elections here and engaging there, I think that can be seen as supporting that mission. I think as we're going to continue to talk as the show progresses, I think the notion, though, of the divisiveness of this issue right now, I think we're seeing present itself in lots of places, and people are feeling compelled to kind of take sides. And I think this is a heat of the moment having taken sides. And I think it's a real challenge. And I think that I've seen Gustavo try to kind of walk it back a little bit, and I don't know that he can do that. I think that people need to be much more judicious, and just a really challenging time for a lot of people. But I think CASA in particular right now, because they crossed the line, and it's hard to get back on the other side.
Well, Mark, not just CASA, but there seems to be an unraveling of the coalition of liberal causes over Hamas's unabashed goal for the eradication of the state of Israel.
Yes, I think that's right. And just to comment before about what Mike's point, I think part of the challenge is although there are these two different entities that exist, you have a common brand, which is CASA. And so that creates the confusion. But your point is, I think one of the great challenges is in this discussion is the progressive wing has focused on more identity and grievance-based politics and sort of creating a hierarchy, if you will, of whose grievance stacks where, as opposed to what I would think we should have traditionally have done, of focusing on democratic values and institutions and the protection of civilians in warfare. And that seems to have receded as a consideration. And instead, we're now trying to figure out, where do Jews in Israel, and where do they stack relative to various organizations? And while that's an important conversation, I think it's also an important conversation, or a more important conversation, to reflect on our shared common values for democratic institutions.
Well, CASA receives a great amount of money and funding, not only from Montgomery County, but the state of Maryland. And it was, in contrast, we had nine Democratic senators in the from the House of Delegates, General Assembly, come out and criticize CASA. Is there going to be a reckoning that that it's one thing to perform services, as CASA has done in the immigrant community, but but when it strays into advocacy, that's gone too far?
Well, and I think what we're seeing here is that government support from the county, from the state, from nonprofits like the Weinberg, are financing and developing this brand, this CASA brand, that CASA is also then using to identify with, frankly, hard left progressive positions. And I submit that many of these services could be performed elsewhere by other entities, and that would not have sort of the toxic associations that CASA has developed, and would be less political. I mean, we have an expectation that when government performs various functions, that it will do so in an apolitical manner, and I think we should have the same expectations when a contractor does the same thing.
So even in its most recent apology, CASA did not directly condemn the Hamas attack, and others have criticized CASA for its more aggressive stances that it has taken on many topics. So is CASA just gotten out of its lane and needs to retrench itself back to what it was? And frankly, can Gustavo Torres, can he do this? Maybe he should be forced to resign. I'll open it up to either one of you.
No, I think it is going to force some significant soul searching, as it should, for CASA, its mission, its role, and how it acts upon that. One of the things that they've done very effectively is be able to create visibility on issues that affect the folks that they represent in the Latino population, and I think they've done that well to provide significant services. But I think that, as we said earlier, I think that there is a challenge sometimes you can't put those pieces together, and the funding, and I think they're going to be forced to go back and be able to very clearly articulate as to, are they a political institution, are they a service institution, and be able to determine how that works and draw some lines that just don't exist today, and it's going to be a real challenging time for them in the next couple of months.
Well, I find it fascinating that not only the supporters of these organizations are now reconsidering what their donations are going to, because they may feel like they have lost control of the message that they originally intended. But we're going to have to break here. When we come back from this short break, a teacher at Tilden Middle School on leave after social media posts in support of Hamas. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Yesterday, it was announced that Sabrina Khan Williams, a teacher at Tilden Middle School, who was at the center of an investigation for her pro-Hamas series of anti-Semitic social media posts, had been suspended pending further investigation. Mark, MCPS spokesperson Chris Cam addressed the issue by saying, as a school community, we must condemn statements demeaning individuals or groups. Is that strong enough response from the school on this issue?
Well, I think as I mentioned before, I think it does miss part of the challenge in this is that these issues are not simply a question of group versus group or, grievance versus grievance. Look, a teacher is entitled to have opinion, and we're certainly not taking her First Amendment rights. The distinction to be drawn is really about Hamas's specific activities, attacking innocent civilians, holding hostages, just what can only be described as terrorism. And that is really beyond the pale of what is appropriate behavior at MCPS.
Well, it's a good question, Mark, because, and Mike, maybe you can address this. There is a balance between, freedom of speech, but also, I think government employees have, responsibility to recognize that sometimes they need to be more circumspect in what they say. Well, I'm not going to even getting into the specifics of what the teacher said. I was struck by the fact that many parents were so shocked by the statements that she made.
I struggle with this a little bit because I think that, and I think we're uniquely positioned as a community because we have such diversity in Montgomery County, and we have families who are directly affected on both sides of the issues. We have Jewish families, we have Arab families, Muslim families who know people who are trapped in the area today. And I think that creates a more visceral reaction. And so I think to Mark's point, I agree. I think we need to step back and be able to be circumspect and focus on the humanity of the situation and to denounce the deeds that are there. What Hamas did, I think, is horrible. That being said, there are humanitarian issues at play here that we also need to be able to talk about, is because we're people, and how do you take care of people in these challenging situations? And I think that this, points to, a situation where, not knowing very, very many of the specifics, an individual who clearly has a personal reaction to this situation and couldn't distinguish between that and her role in front of a classroom leading children and trying to be able to frame that broader issue. And I know that happens. Oftentimes we as people get stuck in those situations where we have to take a step back and say, I can't address this, or I shouldn't address this because I can't do it in the right way. And I think this is a situation where that didn't happen, and now there will be consequences.
Well, what was so shocking, I think, and as I read the comments from the parents, this was a team leader on diversity, equity, and inclusion that became unfiltered. And you would think that a person charged with those responsibilities would be more circumspect.
I think so, but I think also at the end of the day, people are people, and there are cords that get touched. There are buttons that get pushed. There are, not knowing her personal situation or who she knows, I think that happens. But I think that becomes the part is we oftentimes can be pushed too far. The challenge is to be able to then pull yourself back and be able to say, I can't react to the situation in a way I should, and to not react at all, and to remove yourself from that situation. I think that's the challenge here, and I think that can be really hard for anyone. And I don't mean to defend that, because I think what she has said and what was quoted is not something that should be put out there. That being said, not knowing the fuller context, I think we need to recognize that, and how do you help people navigate through that situation?
Well, there definitely being, the controversy has definitely shown a rift in the school, obviously, and the feeling that there are, grievances and victims on both sides. Certainly. Where it's not clear cut. But is it the role of the school to try to address those, or should this be addressed in the home? Mark, I'll give you the last word on
Well,
this.
it's interesting because I was at one point a Tilden in parents, and I recognize that the school has a role in having a conversation about issues like this, particularly when they're so heavily in the media, so front and center that kids are going to be talking about it. That said, as I said, I think I would push back on the values being expressed, and think that this is not just about competing groups. This is about values, and that would be what the conversation that I would have had with my Tilden student.
And
So
I guess the answer to your question, Casey, is yes.
Is specifically because it's in our community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these divisions are not just on the nightly news, on the national stage, not just limited to Pennsylvania or Columbia University. These are issues that affect us all. We have to go on to our last topic. Earlier this week, Osama Bin Laden's previously unpublished letter to America, and that's in quote, was released on TikTok, and some thought it was to great fanfare. There were certainly people that call themselves influencers that had felt compelled to comment on it. In my view, having read it, it's kind of an illegitimate screed against American values that are repeated endlessly by those who are anti-American. And we should not forget that in 2 days, or the day that this is being first shown, Sunday, the 19th, is the 160th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address by President Lincoln. And in its simplicity, it's so wonderful to sum up the essence of the American experience. Mark, how is it then that a sizable percentage of our population has so quickly forgotten the horrors of 9/11 and the fundamental tenets of America, and have forgotten the eloquency expressed by President Lincoln 160 years ago?
We have seen this pivot in the way we frame debates in our politics and the values that we express over the last 10, 15 years. We've also seen the corrosive impact of social media, which seems to have the capacity to allow people to express their views in the worst possible way, and then that gets recycled out and gets balanced out, and it is a huge challenge for us as a society.
Mike, I watched in dismay as videos of influencers, I mentioned that earlier, spoke about the legitimacy of the Bin Laden letter to America, and I frankly can't understand it. It's just that younger generations have not been imbued with American values?
Yeah, I think the challenge, and I think Mark kind of alluded to this, I think one of the challenges that we face right now is, one, I don't think we've focused on kind of who we are and what we are as a people, as well as we perhaps once did. But I think the other thing is that we're at a point right now where it's about how I get someone to pay attention to me. I think Mitt Romney, in an interview I saw with him a couple of weeks ago, talked about how identify members of either party, quite honestly, in the House of Representatives, and those that you recognize aren't those who are actually serious legislators. They're people who have been able to make a name for themselves and be overly visible. And I think that's true in, unfortunately, many things as a result of social media. And so I'm not even sure that the people who are making comments even know what they're commenting on a lot of the time, but they know it's going to get a reaction. And I think that's one of the real challenges that we have. And I think the other piece we have is there's a level of divisiveness out there right now that wants to pick sides on almost every issue. And they know that that's going to get them visibility if they're on one side or the other. And that's the intent.
All right. So before we go to break, I just want to read a few, sentences from Lincoln's beautiful address. We all know by heart 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But it is the concluding portion of the address which I think is so magnificent. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that measure, that cause for which they gave their last full measure. We are highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. I hope that's a message that we all can adhere to. Stay tuned for Parting Shots. Welcome back. Now with Parting Shots, Mark Uncapher.
Casey, earlier this month, the Office of Legislative Audit did a review of the Board of Elections in Maryland, State Board of Elections, and they uncovered the fact that a substantial number of people had attempted to vote more than once, and a few had done it, and there were some issues with registrations that were not appropriate. The finding, though, was that information was not turned over to the state prosecutor and was not made public. I want to make clear that no elections were affected as a result of this, but I think it's important for the Board of Elections to follow the law, to publicize this as a deterrent for people to understand that when the laws are broken, there can be consequences. And I think that would go a long way to create much more confidence in our election system, to know that those steps were being taken.
Thank you, Mark. Mike Knapp, your parting shot.
Thank you very much. Last Saturday, November 11th, in addition to being Veterans Day, was also a point of remembrance in Montgomery County that was led by the Montgomery County Commission on Remembrance and Reconciliation. And it was a ceremony they had known as From Darkness to Light, in where they recognized on Maryland Avenue at the County Council building, which back in the late 1800s used to be the jail for Montgomery County, the lynchings that took place of two individuals, Mr. John Diggs Dorsey and Mr. Sidney Randolph. And they've been working diligently over the last, I think it's almost 3 years, to go back and delve into our past, oftentimes past that we don't want to pay attention to, and make sure that we can identify those individuals who were wrongly accused and then ultimately hanged, but to then bring that together and to recognize that that is part of our history, and how do we as a community accept that, acknowledge that, and then work together to move forward. And they had a wonderful ceremony. They've done a great job of trying to do that as a commission representing our community, and I was honored to be there and just want to thank them for their efforts, because it truly was a memorable day.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you both for appearing this week, and thank you, audience, for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest-hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.